All right. I want to thank everyone who's watched the previous videos. Big response. Can't thank you enough. Let's get some recording done. We want to remove the build folder and we're going to do a game over handling today. So y'all can't see the debug panel at the moment, but now you can. So right around here, we've got a player health, right? This actually gets tracked whenever you get hit by an enemy. See, it's at 2, it's at 1, and it's at 0. So whenever we get to 0, we want to actually make a game over screen, right? But to begin with, we need, at the very least, to know where in the game code we need to implement this. So if we're currently tracking the health of the player whenever they get hit by an enemy, then we can implement a simple check to see what that player's health is when they get hit. And if it ever drops to 0, we can print out game over to indicate the point where we need to implement the game over event. So to begin with, let's go into update, because I believe this is where handle skull collision. Update skull collision. Here we are. So we could do like the other methods here and implement a handle update skull collision enemy. Handle update skull collision enemy equals const instg id. So if player health less than or equal to 0, we print game over. Line 443. Oh, oops. Okay, there we go. Just missing a semicolon. So now, 2, 1, 0. Game over. As you can see right there. Let's go ahead and save this and prepare for what's going to happen next. A lot of the same things that happen on game startup are going to be what happen on game over. So all the same things that we would do to shut the game down, to clean up the variables we're going to need to do, and then we're going to need to reinstantiate everything. But before we do that, let's go ahead and commit what little code we just wrote. And prepare for game over. So let's check out a new branch. Game over. So you want to be able to handle getting multiple game overs in a loop and restarting the game every time. So we'll start there. Real quick, let's take a look at what happens when we actually shut the game down. Whenever we hit the quit button, Q, we set the quit variable to true. And in the main game loop, if quit is ever pressed and quit becomes true, this loop exits, we call cleanup, and then we return exit success. So what happens if we call cleanup? Cleanup is a generic function that does all of this. It clears out all of the various entity maps, vectors, etc., cleans up our textures, and then destroys all of the main rendering components before shutting down our various libraries. So as an example, back over in update, we could call cleanup as an example here. In order to use it, we're going to have to declare that we have an extern void function called cleanup. So now if we get game over, the game will automatically shut down. So let's get hit 3 times. 1, 2, 3. Game over. Game quits. But this isn't really ideal, right? This is... Oh, it does clean up, but it never exited. The program still runs, though. So, we could technically do something like quit equals true in order to achieve the same thing. So realistically, we're probably going to want to do like a partial cleanup. We're going to do something like we want to clean up maybe everything up to BG sprites and maybe even clean up the textures. And then maybe not even that much. Maybe just clean up the sprites, everything up to this point. We could wrap this into like clean up data structures. So the nice thing about clean up data structures, doing it this way, is we isolate all of the different components from the textures and the different things that we need to actually draw and render in the window. And we prepare them for being able to be reloaded later. Because then we can just clear them out, reload them, and then immediately draw the scene again. So I think that's what we're going to do here. So on game load, we do a bunch of stuff, right? So over in init, we have these different inits that we have to handle. Those just simply init the different libraries that we're using, and since we're not shutting them down on game over, we don't have to worry about reinitializing them. But we do have this stuff that happens afterwards. We have BG init, we have init after load textures, we have spawn skull, we have spawn generator. In fact, the next entity ID uses next entity ID from the main. Next entity ID starts off at 0, so it will also have to be reset to 0. It's an important detail because, well, it may or may not matter, but we're going to have to make sure that we properly assign player ID whenever we update. In fact, I think Spawn Skull does this for us already. Yeah, so whatever ID the skull gets, the player gets. So let's get ready to reload all of those variables on game quit, or rather game over, and prepare to reload the game scene entirely and restart that game loop. We might even want to pause the scene and then display some sort of game over and wait for some sort of input from the user before they decide that they want to start playing again. All right, we got some reasonable music that I can kind of work to. So on game over, we want to pause the game temporarily. We also want to display a game over message of sorts, like a texture with text on it. Currently, the only way that we're doing anything related to text is how we do the debug panel. So the debug panel text, all this stuff right here, it's not the most efficient way of going about doing text. It's just to get something in there so that I can see something back. Really, to do text properly, we're actually going to have to create our own textures for every letter and then draw those textures individually whenever we need to like do a text update. And that's going to involve a lot of math, and I'm not doing that right now. But what we are doing is we are going to do a similar thing as to what we're doing now with the debug text and use that to generate a message for game over. Because a game over message is essentially going to be static, right? It's not going to be changing. So we can render this texture once and then reuse it whenever we need to actually show a game over message. The way that we actually do this is we create a text surface first, and then we rip the texture out of that surface. TTF has a method called renderTextBlendedWrapped that returns a text surface given a global font, the text that you actually want to render, and the text color, as well as a debug wrap length. So in a similar fashion, over in the main, where we have a text surface, we can create like a game over surface. Now, back over in the load method, we can kind of copy this line right here and use it as the beginning of load game over surface. We currently don't have access to game over surface yet, but once we add the extern, now we do. So once we actually have that game over surface, we can then create a texture from it. Let's go ahead and copy what we have here. we're unable to render the text surface, we should probably consider cleaning up and exiting. I'm gonna replace the word debug. Well, let's see. Game over texture. We don't have a game over texture yet. So over in the main, we're gonna create a game over texture. Now we have access to it in load. Okay, we have not closed this function yet. Looks like everything built. Let's go over the code and make sure there's no issues. We did that kind of quickly. So, because we're not even calling load game over surface yet. We didn't even call it load game over texture, because realistically we're getting rid of the surface once we're done. And actually, we don't even need to copy these over because we can get that from the texture query if we need to. Now we're not actually calling this anywhere, right? And actually, here we are. And load texture and load textures. Remember, we're actually doing all of the real assets by JSON file. We can also go ahead and call load game over texture here. That way, the whole process is wrapped up into a function call that we're already using. Drink some coffee. Now, while we're in load game over texture, we can go ahead and render the text, right? So we actually don't want texture text. We want like game over. So no complaints about that, so that's good. We're just hard coding in some text right now, but now that we have the game over text texture like set, and we'll probably even need to create a different font specification for it. We need to actually draw the game over text to the screen on game over, which is effectively going to be like pausing the game and then showing the input, right? Like, all of this stuff happens if the game is paused, but if it's game over, then effectively we're going to be pausing the game as well. So, like, for instance, we need to do something like else if is game over, right? We haven't written that yet, but let's think about this first before we do anything. Because we have a means to pause the game. We have a means to clean up and exit the game without having any memory leaks. And we have a way to start the game, and a lot of these things can be recalled after we clean up the game. So if the game is over because the player's health is hit 0, then we want to effectively pause the game and then draw the game over texture to the screen. And then we want to handle either exiting the game or restarting the game. So if it's game over, let's start by pausing the game. So if not is paused, so if you pause the game, this would be true. Or rather, if it's not paused and it's not game over, so let's go ahead and do is game over. And over in the updates, all right, so if is game over, so if we die, the game should effectively pause once we uncomment these lines right here. Actually, we don't even need to. We need to just run the game. So let's get hit 3 times. 1, 2, 3. Game pause. Look at that. And it still receives input, which is great. Because we separated the handle input from the handle input component functions. So there's 2 different contexts for when we handle inputs. Similarly, if it's game over, we could have a different set of inputs. Just like if when the game is paused, we might offer a set of, options or a menu screen of some sort that the user can actually navigate through. And this is all on the agenda. I just want to talk through the process leading up to that as I do it. So now that we have the game pausing on game over, let's like indicate that it's game over. Because if it's game over, we're going to print game over. And effectively, this is where we will do the rendering of the game over texture. So if is game over, blah, blah, blah. Let's get hit 3 times. 1, 2, 3. So we can see all the game over spam, right? So we know that works. Let's actually render a texture. So what does that entail again? Let's take a look at source render to understand that. So when the game ends up being paused, everything's already drawn to the screen. So we don't have to worry about like clearing the screen or anything unless we want to do something custom. So let's imagine what that custom thing might be like. Void render game over. So we would clear the screen. Let's make it full black. Let's also copy the game over texture to the target texture. Or wait, no, sorry. Game over texture, and then oh, so the source rectangle I think we do query texture. Yeah. It's query texture, pointer to texture. Actually, null, null, and W, and H. SDL rect source equals 0, 0, width, height. SDL rect destination equals 0, 0, and then let's say we wanted to do the whole screen and just make a really big game over text. We can actually pull this from the config, target texture width, config, target texture height. Um, would this count as a frame draw? Maybe we should count it as a frame draw. So we have a couple things to add in. Oops. Oh, right, up here. Game over texture. Non-constant. Oh, okay. Now we got this render game over function. And on game over, it should, once we add it in here, clear the screen so we don't actually see anything anymore. Here we go. Let's do this thing. All right, let's get hit 3 times. 1, 2, 3. Uh-oh. Render game over didn't trigger. It didn't appear to trigger. All right, so we printed the game over. Let's see what happened. Is game over equals true? Render game over should have been called. Oh, it never presented. Oops. Big thing to forget there. All right, now it should work. 1, 2, 3. Oh, it is glitching bad. Oh, we never reset the renderer target. Whoops. So that copies the texture over. Then we change the target, and then we also have to copy the target texture over. Actually, TTW and TTH could just be um, the same source and destination rectangles as the target texture and source. Now we should actually have a properly rendering game over situation. Well, it screen blanks, so that's a good start. However, what's going on with the oh, right, we never actually loaded the game over text. No, we did, didn't we? We did actually load the game over texture. Game over texture equals null. Uh-oh. Why is that? Oh, whoops. It's trying to do it from text surface. Whoops. This is supposed to be game over surface. Alright, now we should be good to go. I know there's many tries, but you're going to see me mess up things along the way. Yes! Okay. That's huge. It's also so big that it's going off the screen. So we can make that smaller. So let's load game over texture. And then over in the render, oh, target texture destination dot width, target texture destination dot height. I'm realizing there's probably a lot of instances where I'm actually referring to the config value for this rather than the the value that's actually set once the game loads, and I could probably fix that. So source and destination, we're going to change this to that, change this to that. So now it's going to be half the size that it previously was. Okay. Naturally, we're going to want to use a much bigger font. So G font is really at the moment exclusively used for like the global font. In this case, only for the debug text. We'll probably change the name of that to debug font, but now we're going to do game over fonts. So over in init, we have init G font. We're going to change this to init fonts. At the moment, we now have a G font and a game over font. Game over font size. We're going to have to play around with. Might even consider making a map of fonts if we end up needing to use too many different ones. Well, we need to make sure that we clean it up when the game is actually shut down. So we load the game over font. We load game over text. And now it should actually use the specified font size, which should smooth it out and make it look a lot cleaner. My throat is starting to hurt a little bit. Okay, that looks a lot cleaner. Excuse me. Oh, that looks very clean. Now, ideally, we would want this to be centered, right? So let's calculate how we can center it. So if we have a width and a height specified, then um, so for instance, the center of the image is, or rather, yeah, the center of the image is at w divided by 2. So better yet, I think we could probably get away with doing something like this. Excuse me. So much for this in one take. Okay, that's not quite center. But We take the that actually gets us back to the left. Oh no, we don't want that for the X. That's a lot better. But you notice it's not in the right position when we full screen it. So we might have to handle full screen and non-full screen situations, but realistically we shouldn't have to do that. We should be able to make this generic enough. Two, three. Oh, at the very bottom, no, that's not what we want. Still at the bottom. The Y seems kind of high. I don't know. I mean, effectively this works, but I get really OCD about positioning. Target texture height divided by 2. And if we put this at 0, I want to do like a bounding box or something around it. It seems a little bit stretched too, doesn't it? The X seems correct. It just seems a little bit down for where I would think it would appear. I mean, effectively, we could even make it a quarter of the size. Now it doesn't even show all the way. Um, so the destination needs to be as wide as. Oh, yeah. Oh, we're overwriting the W and the H from previously by doing that. That was a real subtle type bug to deal with. There we go. Now it looks proper, and it looks like it's in, or at least that looks pretty correct for its position. Still looks pretty high up, but I also think that if we were to have caps, we'd be able to see that it's actually loading in the correct spot. So let's load this with all caps game over instead. Here we go. Okay. That's pretty good. So this would be a good checkpoint. And in the to do, something about the sizes changes on full screen, right? Yeah, the size of the target texture stuff does change. So target texture width and height change. So realistically, it should just be the X position that changes. So when the target texture destination is updated, wouldn't this also change because it has to recalculate the target texture destination? Yeah, 16. Oh, I guess this isn't constant. So this is calculating correctly. Like, if I were to do this, let's get a game over. See, that shows up in the correct spot, whether or not we're full screen or not. The problem isn't necessarily the fact that we're going full screen and the target texture destination changing so much as because the size of the game over texture is constant, this width divided by 2 is not getting adjusted properly. So if we were to, instead of using CX, and actually just put it at a quarter of the width, it should properly adjust depending on. See, it doesn't like quite center here, right? It kind of looks more centered here. You can even see it like adjusting over a little bit. The width, not changing at all. So let's try seeing what it looks like if we don't mess with the height. It's not bad. We could even set it up so that we start like presenting a bunch of in-game stats for when you die, and then, you know, press to continue or something like that. Because that game over message gets rendered once at the very beginning of the game when you load everything up. So if we wanted to do something similar with the debug panel, we're going to have another texture with a different sized font and actually render all of the different variables onto another surface, get that texture, and then present that. We're not going to do that right now, though, because the next step in this whole process is going to be to, you know, because at the moment you can press Q, which is currently handled by handle input, to actually quit the game. Or we want to be able to press a button to start it, you know, start again, restart the game. So that's the next step in this whole process. We're going to take a little bit of a break, and we're going to get back to recording in a minute. Actually, before I do that, we're going to go ahead and clean this section up a bit and commit what we have. All right, now we can take a break. Okay, now that we actually have the game over screen rendering, we want to actually like reload the game whenever they press a certain key. So if the game is currently over and the game over screen is displaying, we want to receive some input from the user. When we're handling input and we receive a key down event, no matter what, if they hit Q, whether or not the game is over, we're going to set the quit variable to true. If they press any key during the game over, we're going to print out a little message to start with. Because this is the location that we're going to want to, well, possibly reload the game, or actually set up the series of events necessary to properly reload the game. We'll go ahead and get hit. 1, 2, 3, game over. And you can see over in the terminal we have our handle game over key press message actually triggering, because this is the default case or the switch statement inside of the handle key down method function, whatever you want to call it. So what do we do next? Let's take a look at main. So shoutouts to Plutonium from Pound LRH, because he's totally correct in suggesting that all of the initialization functions that I'm calling realistically should be inside of one function. The order of the spawning and the initialization of things really does matter, though. And we have to be very careful not to just shove everything in there, because certain things won't need to be reinitialized. Not everything is going to need to be called again. And calling certain things a second time might actually break certain things. So we need to be very explicit about the order of things that we're calling and what we're actually doing. So if there are any opportunities for us to wrap functions up, then we're going to do that, but we're not going to force it. It's going to be something that occurs organically from the bottom up, as opposed to top down. We're kind of deep in at this point to attempt any sort of top down design, but in the future for other components, there might be opportunities for that. But when I say bottom up, what I'm really talking about is taking note of the different functions that we need to actually call, because what happens on cleanup, right? Because we showed that we could actually call cleanup on game over, and then we could actually exit successfully if we want to. So cleanup, we actually did a wrapping of the data structures earlier, because all of them are basically calling clear. So cleanup data structures does that, and then cleanup textures does that. And the reason that we separate it out this way is because if we're reloading the game, then we want to clean up the data structures, right? That's part one. And if we've cleaned up the data structures but we left the textures in, then we don't have to reload the textures. So that ends up being one less thing that we have to do. And similarly, we don't want to close the fonts, so we don't want to call this cleanup method, because this is only when we're actually exiting the game, when we're actually leaving, as opposed to just like restarting the game in a loop, which is kind of what we're doing. So for instance, render game over would do this, and then we would want some sort of reload game type function, right? Because render game over would do this, and handle input would do this, and on handle input, we want to do something else, right? Like over in handle input, let's say we get a game over key press indicating that the user wants to start the game again. Well, we're going to need to call clean up data structures at the very least before we can call any of the init methods over again. So clean up data structures, we're going to need this declared over in the main or somewhere else. But for right now, actually, we don't need to make that extern because it's in the main. Or better yet, perhaps not here. So perhaps we call cleanup data structures right here to start with, because we're mentally reasoning through what has to happen in order for the game to restart. the next step, after we clean up the data structures, would be to because realistically, we only want to call that cleanup function once, right? And then we take a look at the init. We've got this function called init after load textures. And what this does is this, did we clear out that vxvec and clean up? We did not. So over in the main, we've got to pull these over. And then we also have to add them to so now that we know that we're cleaning up the bat vectors as well, because this gets called on init after load textures. So this is something that we would want to call in our handle input after we call cleanup. And eventually this will all get wrapped into like a super function. So we have some other functions that we want to call bginit, spawn skull, and spawn generator. So let's do bginit. The bginit it's called before init after load textures. And then we call spawn skull and spawn generator. And I could be missing something here too, but and then there's also a spawn generator. Oh, why is it breaking the line like that? That's fucking awful. Jesus. Oh, is it because okay. It's not taking into account it's doing line wrapping. That's why it looks so bad. Okay, so back over here. There we go. Yeah, see, it looks right if you have it set there. So now we have spawn generator, we have that. So these are also called in main on game start. Let's see. Coffee is life. So then we have to set is game over to false. And then hopefully, this is all we should need to do in order to actually reload the game. So let's see if that worked. So we're going to get hit again, get hit one more time, game over, press any key. Uh-oh, where'd the skull go? Uh-oh. Where'd the skull go? So I don't see any evidence that the skull was moving. He wasn't on the screen. Normally we have a player position at the bottom of the debug panel that we can see. So we'll press any key, and player position's not actually updating at that point. So, even though the game is rendering, the game is actually doing its thing. So, what do we need to fix here? Oh, right. Um, handle input components. Spawn skull. So what happens when spawn skull is called a second time? Player ID wasn't equal to -1, so it doesn't actually call this. So on handle inputs, clean up data structures, player ID gets set to -1. Now it should actually work. hit, game over, press any key, and player skull's back. Now, there's the bats. So we should actually be in a loop now. So let's, oh, player health. Player health needs to be reset also. Player health. We're gonna need to like make a a quick function for that too. But let's make sure that because yeah, like we're gonna have to initialize. I mean, we're really hard coding things in here, so we're gonna need to like make initialization functions to like set the variables at start. I don't know that we're going to have same game necessarily, but it is a note that I want to take note of, right? So player health, max player health equals 3. Or the player max health. Currently, there's no power up that increases that or anything, so we're just getting something that works right now. All right, so we're gonna get hit, hit again, continue, loop begins all over again. We can pause, we can unpause, get hit, we can get hit, kill an enemy, get hit, game over, restarts. We'll work on a more descriptive or visually compelling game over screen. The fact that it works for right now is just more than enough. Getting it in place is the important part. Getting it working is the important part. You can always fine-tune and make things better once you have it working. The entire fervor, the entire rush of programming is to get something that works to start with. Because going back and making changes is just about taking something that does work, breaking it up into its various components, and then fine-tuning them individually, as in applying that same process to a much smaller thing. Actually, some notes on the things that have changed since last time, as you probably noticed, is that we have lifetime on the blood particles now. They are no longer just running to the edge of the screen. They actually die after so many frames. In addition, the placement of the bats is a lot more intelligent this time around. I've actually broken up the y-axis into essentially grid points where the bats can spawn, and we make sure to randomly select so that they don't spawn on top of each other in a particular wave. And each bat also has their own velocity. So when 3 bats spawn, you get 3 different positions as well as 3 different speeds. And this has a pretty nice effect. It allows for the player to get into a nice rhythm of going back and forth between rows and killing bats on each row. And it's actually kind of zen. It feels really nice. And I look forward to applying some pressure to the player. Now that we have a really good in-game feedback loop going where we can die. Let's see how far we can go before we die. It might be a little bit. I might make a mistake. I think I got hit there. I have 1 hit left before I die. Gotten some health. Game over. I kind of forced that, but it's okay. Okay, so there's a lot that we need to reset. I've still got the original power-up boosts that I ended with. So that's part of the variable resetting that I'm going to have to do. It also shows still like the number of enemies escaped, the number of knives fired, number of knives in my inventory, max number of knives. So naturally, and total soul shards collected. So naturally, setting up the variables to be initialized via some mass initialization function is going to be very beneficial to this whole process. All right, guys, we implemented game over and we implemented game restart, and the infrastructure is there to make things a lot more clean going forward. I want to thank everyone again for their support and watching these videos and actually following along and encouraging me to continue doing this, because we doing it, fam. Dark Mage out.